Good morning, good evening, good night. Welcome back, everyone, to Lana's Little Things with me, Dr. Lana, specialist gerontologist, where we talk all things on living agelessly, bridging generational gaps, family caregiving, entrepreneurship, and just life itself. And speaking of life, one of my special guests tonight, depending on where you are, is someone I met on another platform. And she belongs to a group of persons called the Death Deck. So I thought, in our Caribbean, the last thing we do is talk about death. Like the last thing, literally. We would rather talk about every sort of disaster, but when it comes to final days, end of life planning, funeral planning, wills, that's it. It's almost as if we've grown up to figure if I speak about death, then I'm gonna die. And that really does lead into so many fears and delays and pain for families because often the person who's not well hides their illness from families because they don't want them to suffer. But when the end does come, the family is suffers even more because they now feel, well, we could have helped. Why didn't you tell us something? What happens? There's no closure. And it's like a spiral. And so I really am so grateful to that everything aligned and I met and I looked at this group and I'm like the Death Deck what are these people? I mean it really did look kind of weird, but I'm like I'm be curiosity because I grew up next to Frugal Home, so Death was like, okay, they're sleeping, let's go see who it is. But I know many people do not have that experience, so let me introduce my wonderful guest and you will see her full face in a minute. Her name is Lisa Pahl. Hope I got that spelled correctly. She is the CEO of the Death Deck LLC, deathdeck.com, and she'll leave all your details. We'll leave them all for you. That's a company that creates tools to inspire meaningful conversations on what matters most in our lives and in our deaths. As a licensed clinical social worker, accredited in hospice and palliative care, with over 18 years of experience, although she does not look it, in hospice and 7 years in emergency medicine. Well, that's also my bread and butter. So I think we just seem to love the excitement and the macabre at the same time. Lisa helps people cope with illness, dying, and grief. She's also an expert contributor for Help Text, which provides expert grief and mental health support via text messages, and a volunteer for the Humane Prison Hospice Society Project, which provides palliative care training and support for incarcerated individuals. I find that very touching, with a passionate belief that peace at the end begins with meaningful conversations over time. Lisa engages people in talking about and preparing for this important stage of life. And so I'm going to just leave it. Well, welcome, Lisa. It is such a pleasure to have met you and for you to be on this audience. And I am so, you know, bowled over is an expression we have in Barbados because we play cricket, similar to baseball, but bowled over. And with what you do, because it is so needed, as you always describe in your page, it is the one thing that's gonna happen to everybody. We're all gonna die, and yet it's the one topic that we talk the least about. So please, I've read your astounding journey. I know you deal with families on a one-on-one level, but can you give us a few? I'm going to leave it most to you, but can you give us a little introduction to what brought you here and what you find most meaningful and what you find most challenging? I know that's a lot, but you take it away.
Mhm. Well, I am always glad to talk about death and how we can better prepare for that. It's become a life mission of mine. And, I do, of course, understand that it's not easy to have these conversations. And I think a lot of that is because of our how we were raised and what is kind of the norm in terms of our family, in terms of our community, in terms of our culture. And so it takes a little bit of a shift to be able to begin having more of these conversations. So I came to this work after working in community mental health. I was working for about 7 years when I moved to Los Angeles with kids from East LA. And while I really enjoyed it, um, it was also really challenging to feel like I was making an impact. Um, and so I kind of got burnt out working with the population after a couple of my clients were murdered in a gang fight. And so I decided that I wanted to kind of switch the type of clientele I was working with, or switch kind of the focus of what I was doing from trying to help kids and teens with their behavior problems to supporting people at end of life. And so I kind of stumbled into it because I was looking for my entire career prior to that point, I had been working in people's homes. So every social work I had, job that I had, I was going into people's homes. And I just really love that aspect of the work that I've done. There's so much intimacy, there's a vulnerability, there's a an invitation, there's a sharing of drink and a little bit of a snack and that sort of thing that really connects in a much less sterile environment than like an
Yeah.
office setting. And so when I stumbled into hospice, by the end of the first week, I knew that I had figured out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And that was when I was, I guess, around 30. And so I, from that point, I ended up meeting Lori and Joe. Joe was a young man in his 40s who was living with pancreatic cancer. And from the time he was diagnosed, he said, I'm a statistic of one, I'm going to beat this disease. And unfortunately, he lived about a year and then hospice was brought in. I was the hospice social worker, Lori was his wife. And Joe, this is in home hospice in Los Angeles. And Joe had um, not only his wife and little kids present for his dying process, but he also had his parents, he had his siblings, he had friends. And so there were just a lot of people with a lot of different opinions about about, about what Joe would want, about things like medication. Some members of the family felt like dying was a spiritual experience. Some members of the family felt like it was more of symptoms he was experiencing that needed to be medicated. So, um, as you can imagine, it was a little chaotic,
Mm.
and which is the case for a lot of people at that point in time. And basically, all these people were saying what Joe would want, but no one knew because no one had had any conversations with Joe about it. So, about 5 years later, his wife reached out to me and said that she wanted to do something about it. She was feeling like there were a lot of people that might be in a similar situation. And so we began meeting and kind of developing a friendship. And we decided to create a card game to try to help people talk about these topics before a medical crisis, before a terminal diagnosis. Because we know once someone is in that emotional state, or once there's like a treatment regimen, it's a lot harder to initiate these conversations because usually people get in a fight mentality. And that's a hard place to interject questions about what they would want at end of life. So our idea was to use humor and multiple choice questions and call it the Death Deck, which lots of people told us not to. It was too morbid. But we said, no, actually, we want people to be able to say the word death. We want people to talk about death. And because we want people to have a death as close as possible to what they envision for themselves and
Hmm.
want for themselves, we want family members to feel confident that they know what their person wants in different scenarios. We want people to feel confident after they died that they took care of them in the way that they wanted to be cared for, thus reducing the second guessing in grief.
Yes.
And then there's all the practical aspects of like, if we don't talk about it, we aren't necessarily making preparations that are needed on paper, legal documents. And when we don't have those in place, it causes a lot of extra stress for our family. So that's how the death debt came to be.
Wow. I see you with a stack of cards there. So is that really like a deck of cards? And can you tell me more about those decks of cards? And do you have more than one type and what they mean, what
Mhm.
they all refer to?
Yeah, so the Death Deck was our first deck in 2018. There's 112 questions, so this is our biggest deck. And this is the deck that I say there's a little bit of something for everybody.
Mm.
Um, it's meant to be played with family, with friends, people who are trying to talk about the future, advanced care planning, um, people who are curious and just kind of want to explore the topic more, people who have death anxiety and want to kind of work through the questions.
Yes.
Um, but because there's a lot of humor and there's a wide variety of questions, it's not necessarily the deck I recommend for people that are seriously ill or of an advanced age. Because when people get closer to the end of life, we tend to want to have more sensitivity
Yes.
around the topic.
Yeah.
So that's where the end of life deck came in.
Okay.
So the end of life deck, you can see it has a little koala on it instead of the skull. This is the deck that I use with my hospice and palliative care patients.
Hmm.
And it really digs into topics about end of life preferences. So, how do you feel about touch as you're approaching end of life? How do you feel about visitors when
Yes.
you're not looking your best?
Right.
How do you feel about um, the type of sounds and people around you? Are there people you don't want to be present and seeing you in a certain way? And so it helps give people more of a sense um, that they have a little more control over the room and the events that happen. And then it also helps the family to not be arguing over what they would want because there's conversations about what they would want. And then last year, I created the dementia deck. This is a smaller deck. The EOL deck is a smaller deck too. It has about 52 questions. The dementia deck has about 45. And the dementia deck is a little bit different because it's talking about the type of care and treatment that you would want if you were living with dementia.
Okay.
So the goal of that is to really help people think through these different moments, decisional moments that arise often. As you know, as a gerontologist, that there are these moments that arise for people as they are approaching or as they're living with dementia that basically families are making decisions on their behalf. And a lot of those involve, feeding tubes, involve um, basically at what point someone would want comfort measures and at what point they would want all measures to be utilized to extend their life as long as possible.
Yeah.
So it's this one is more of a planning tool for the future.
Now that one, of course, I don't know if love is an appropriate word, but I really do love the entire concept from, and thank you so much for you and your team creating this, designing this, because it is, it's not making light of or making fun of death, as you said. It's not that we're minimizing that death and grief won't affect us all. As you know, in my family, we had spoken before. I've had deaths of family members and sudden deaths, and even my cat and pet death is a whole different ball game as well. He just died 2 days ago. So but he had to be euthanized. So death in itself, it faces us all the time. We don't want to minimize it, but we also want to be, as you said, comfortable around it. And for dementia, as a gerontologist, yes, before, even if person starts starting to have that memory impairment, brain fog, whatever, it's still I find a great tool, because then they are still able to feel some sense of control, where in terms of this is what I want, this is what I don't want, or I wouldn't like that for myself, and that may change. So but at least we started the conversation. What I like too about the different cards is, as we have a group, or I should ask you first, but my thinking is, if you have a family sit down, maybe that might be a little too maybe friends sit down, or you have a small group, and then you start talking about it. And maybe in 2 weeks' time, 3 months' time, something changes, and the person with dementia, the person may have gotten worse, or they may have changed their mind on something, or something for end of life may have changed. What have you found works best in terms of what you would suggest? Where do we start? Depending on where we are, if it's an end of life or a dementia situation. We said the other ones, the larger ones, are for the lighter topics. So for the deeper topics, where would you suggest, or what have you found is a great way to bring these cards in to help families to cope?
Are you asking like where to store the information?
No, what I'm saying is, how do they use the cards?
Mm-hmm.
And what have you found? Do they do it as a family? Have you found doing it with a physician, with someone like yourself, social worker, doing it more formally, or just guiding them to do it less formally? What have you found works, and what would you suggest?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say the Death Deck is a great one to play with family because it does get into the advanced care planning questions, and um, but it has a wide variety of questions. So people who are uncomfortable with the topic, they can start with a question that's further removed. So it's not specifically asking, how do I feel about my death? But it's more about, how do you feel about open caskets? Or,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on if mediums can communicate with the dead or not? So what I suggest to families, there's usually one person who really wants to play it, and then they're trying to get their family on board. So a
Okay.
couple tips that I have learned is one, stack the deck. So and what I mean by that is choose the questions that you think will play best for your family. Don't leave questions in there that might get drawn that you think are going to shut down the conversation.
Okay.
So you have control over this. You're the host in this way. And so I would remove any questions that you feel like would not be helpful for your family. And then, secondly, if they're reluctant to play, I always encourage people to choose a day that it's your day. So whether that's Mother's Day, whether that's your birthday, whether that's you're hosting the holiday meal, you're in charge. You dictate what happens. And that's a great opportunity to tell people. And then just give it a timeline. I suggest to people that you say, okay, just for a half hour. It's a half hour. Let's just play. And the feedback I've received is that everybody went much longer than the half hour. They get involved in conversations. People actually have a lot of thoughts and opinions. They have stories to share. um, because we avoid talking about death and dying, it can feel really interesting, to learn about, people you're incredibly close with. You may not know what they think about a lot of these topics because you've never talked about it. And so the other really beautiful benefit of having these type of conversations is that it brings families closer together. It gives you these rich conversations that can actually strengthen your relationships when you're digging into topics of life or death.
Yeah.
So that's a little bonus that I like about these conversations.
That's awesome. I guess it makes death a little less scary for those for whom, or uncertain for those who may find it that way. That's
Mhm.
excellent. So I love the concept of the three cards. You promised me faithfully there will be a pet one, so I'm looking forward for that. Okay, I'm putting that one on you. So we will, I'm looking forward to that. And I just wanted you to let our viewers know, well, what would you, two things we'll do with where we will find you. But first of all, what would you say to any family who has to deal with these broad, deep topics? When you go into a family and they've requested you, what would you say? What would you recommend physicians say when a patient comes and says, Doc, I think my mom is having dementia, or my aunt is dying, or this person is in hospital? What would you say? Here's what you can do. What is one sentence that you tend to start with?
Talk to them now. Talk to them now.
Okay.
Even if it's awkward and you're uncertain of how to start conversations, of course, I created these tools to try to help, but even if you don't have the tools, just beginning a conversation with your person before they lose the ability to tell you. And I've had so many families say, oh, I wish I had just asked them what
Yeah.
they thought about this.
Yeah.
And so be a little brave. It takes bravery to start these conversations. And it's a real gift to your family. If you are on the receiving end and maybe you are dealing with illness, it is such a gift to your family to talk about your preferences for care.
It
Um,
does.
and so the last thing that I'll say is that I do also have a Spanish version of the Death Deck coming out
Okay.
by the end of the year. So that's something fun and exciting. And you can find me and my products at thedeathdeck.com.
Okay.
And I'm also on social media at the Death Deck. And I try to do a lot of education and and other ways of support for people who are interested in the topic.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you to my audience. You've brought death to life. And I really do appreciate it. So from my heart to yours, this is how we end. Thank you. And bye, everyone. Thank you so much for your participation. And just give us your feedback. Just and continue the fine work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.